Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 64 of the Memorial Memo, KSR's Kentucky Women's Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Phoenix Stevens. As always, excited to be back on here, but extra excited this time around because Kentucky Women's Basketball retains its head coach. Over the weekend, there was some chatter about Kenny Brooks going to Virginia. Turns out there was some smoke. Turns out there was some fire associated with that smoke. I'm going to get into all of that. And now that Kenny's staying at Kentucky, I'm going to talk about some, potential transfer portal targets. Just some scuttlebutt, obviously. I haven't heard like, hey, Phoenix, Kentucky is going after this person. Haven't heard that yet. I think the staff is, well, honestly, I think the Virginia stuff kind of puts some of that on hold. But I think the staff is just wanting to keep things close to the chest, like normal. It's not really anything different. But I do want to provide you all like, hey, maybe we can look out for this person, So want to get into all of that, but first, I would be doing us all a disservice if I didn't talk about this Kenny Brooks Virginia situation. So I have it written down here at my side because I don't want to miss anything. It's a really big kind of thing to kind of just talk off the top of your head, so I have some stuff written down. So, obviously, the news itself, right, is that Kenny Brooks turns down the Virginia job. That's the news itself. So just to go through the timeline of things and how I heard things went. So Saturday evening is when I hear that Kenny Brooks could be a candidate for the Virginia job, right? At first, it kind of sounds like speculation. It kind of sounds like, oh, he's from Virginia and he competed in the ACC before. This makes sense. But, like it sounded a little bit more than scuttlebutt, or it sounded a little bit more than just speculation, I should say. But, things did get quiet over the weekend, right? Of course, it was Easter weekend. Happy late Easter to all of us Easter people, right? I wasn't asking, admittedly, over the weekend. And then Monday night is when things really took a shift as far as, again, what I was hearing. Okay, so Monday night, talks about the potential of Kenny Brooks being offered by Virginia. That starts to pick up, right? That thing I had heard on Saturday that was possible, it had started to gain some steam Monday night. And, to me, and I think I reported this, I want to say it was like super early Tuesday morning, because honestly, I think I woke up to go take a piss and I saw it on my phone and my phone was being blown up, where, something I said on the message board got leaked. And by the way, I will say real quick, go subscribe to KSR Plus. Like, obviously you all are here for women's basketball stuff. We've got everything you'd want to know. Women's basketball, men's basketball, football, all of that. Baseball season's rolling. Everything you could want over there. So, firstly, I would say go subscribe, because we're pretty good about not leaking stuff on the women's basketball side of stuff. Don't know what happened. Someone leaks it. Something I said where I thought, if Kenny Brooks, and this is as of Monday night / super early Tuesday morning, if Kenny Brooks had gotten offered the Virginia job, I thought he was gone. Right? Just the things I was hearing, there's factors outside of money for Kenny. Obviously, with Virginia, he's from the state of Virginia. Apparently, he has family in the area. And again, he has already shown that he can compete in the ACC, and not only compete, he can win an ACC tournament championship and make a run to a Final Four, right? He has done that in the ACC. So there was this very clear path, I think, for Kenny to be like, I'm going to go take a chance here at this school, which, by the way, I mentioned this on the board, and I don't know if I said it on Twitter or not, but one of Reddit's really big boosters, Alex Ohanian, first of all, he's the founder of Reddit. I thought that was neat. Also found out yesterday he's Serena Williams' husband. So that's very random. But he is a very big women's basketball booster, right? He's a big Virginia booster, but specifically Virginia women's basketball booster as well. And their athletic director, Carla Williams, played women's basketball. Played at Georgia, I believe, but did play women's basketball. So again, there are a lot of reasons, just kind of optics, that make you say, oh, wait a minute, maybe Kenny could be going to Virginia, right? I even heard, Kenny might be willing to take a pay cut and go over there, right? Like that was something someone floated to me, especially if it meant there was an increase in resources. But then, obviously early Tuesday morning is when I posted that tweet that caught fire on social media. And then into the afternoon time of Tuesday, the momentum for Kenny Brooks to Virginia started to slow down, right? For whatever reason, it just started to seem like, oh, wait a minute. Let's look at these other offers Virginia has made. This isn't really that impressive. Like to the other candidates that they kind of were talking to, their offers weren't really all that impressive, it sounded like. And then based on what I heard, it didn't appear that Kenny was sudden, it didn't appear it was certain he was gone if he got offered like I thought, right? I originally thought, yeah, if he gets offered, he's gone. But the more I learned, the more I talked to people, it started to sound more like, if he gets offered, there's a very good chance he's gone, but it's not certain. And then, of course, Tuesday evening, Virginia names Richmond's Aaron Russell as their next head coach, and Kenny Brooks obviously stays at Kentucky. Which, by the way, I think that's a pretty good hire for them. Obviously, get an in-state guy from Richmond. They were a sub 500 mid-major that is now, one of the best mid-majors in the country, and a perennial top 25 team, or at least, I don't know if perennial is the word, but like a consistent top 25 team, right? So I think, with additional resources at Virginia, he could do well there. And then, of course, after we're like, oh, the Virginia job's taken. Whew, thank goodness. I dig in a little bit more. I figure out that Kenny Brooks was officially offered the job and turned it down, and I report that late Tuesday night, and here we are in the evening of Wednesday. So, there's a lot to the situation. At the end of the day, I do think, if you just look at it grand scheme, you say, I think Kentucky has done enough so far to keep Kenny Brooks, right? I think, the obviously he's one of the top 10 highest paid coaches in America, I think. I think there's enough NIL and resources for him to say, well, Virginia just, I don't know if that was the opportunity I should take at this moment. I think he feels like Kentucky's where I need to be right now. But I do want to say, Kenny was, just based on the things I heard and everything I dug about it, he was very serious about that Virginia job and didn't end up taking it, And when I look at the situation and I look at Kenny's comments, after the Texas game where he was talking about he's going to keep fighting for more NIL and resources, when I look at what Kenny said after that game and I look at this whole Virginia situation, and this is just me, right? But if I'm Kentucky, I would probably use this opportunity, like this offseason, and really now, because it's transfer portal season, to increase the NIL funding for women's basketball, right? I think Kenny, seriously considering the Virginia job, indicates that he might feel like, hey, maybe there are better opportunities. Maybe I can realistically go compete for a championship somewhere else. Maybe there are other schools who could be willing to invest more in women's basketball, right? I have absolutely no reason to think or suggest that Kenny Brooks doesn't like being at Kentucky, anything like that. I actually think he and his family really do like being here, right? I remember preseason, I was talking to Jordan Obi, talking about how Kenny's got this big, nice swimming pool, and they love it. And that's, like all these things. Like, I think Kenny does like being here, and he does talk about the fan base and the state in general as, I like being here and I enjoy this. But, at the same time, I think you could say that if you want to keep Kenny Brooks in the long term, right, because he's already listening to Virginia, or at least already was hearing them out and considered the job, I think you could probably say that Kentucky needs to look at enhancing its NIL and its resources. I think that becomes really important when you couple that with the fact that Mitch Barnhart, of course, who hired Kenny Brooks at Kentucky, is stepping down on June 30th, right? Just an objective point of view, if I put myself in the shoes of the head coach, I'm sitting there going, well, this guy who hired me and, built me this nice $82 million facility, get made me one of the highest paid coaches in America. If he, when he leaves, what am I being promised here, right? There's an area, and I mentioned this during the coaching search. There's this area of uncertainty, I think, heading into the next AD. And as someone else on KS Board said, I think there's also the added fact that, Will Stein's in that same situation. He's not going to bolt, right? Maybe he should give it a chance with next AD. And I don't disagree with that necessarily. But I think if you're Kenny Brooks and you are this established head coach, I think there's a difference. And I think there's a difference when you've been to the Final Four, done things like that. And again, look, Will Stein, the difference between Will Stein and Kenny Brooks, for example, is that, again, Will Stein's not an established head coach. And, I don't think, let's just take Penn State for an example, right? This big-time football program with probably more money to spend than Kentucky. I don't think they're going to come calling for him yet. Okay? But if let's say Tennessee, for example, if Kim Caldwell has another horrible year down there, they fire her, what's stopping Kenny from going down there? You know what I mean? So, again, I have no reason to think that Kenny doesn't like being at Kentucky. I actually think he does like being here a whole lot. But I do think, again, just me, I would say if you're Kentucky, maybe start looking at enhancing the NIL and the resources. I think you have to understand, and this is for the admin, really, whoever follows Mitch Barnhart, even Mitch Barnhart this summer, I would say if you're Kentucky, you have to know that the resources have to match the expectations, right? And the expectations have to match the resources, right? Kenny Brooks has been to a Final Four, just took Kentucky to its first Sweet 16 in a decade, right? And now the question becomes like, well, how much further can we go? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. We got these transfer portal targets that I'm really excited to talk about. How much further can we go, right? Because I'm a believer that Kentucky, here at this school, you can compete for championships. I'm a believer in that. I would probably move on to a different job because, to be honest, I wouldn't really have fun covering 12-win basketball teams every single year. But with Kenny Brooks here, 3 McDonald's All-Americans, a senior Claire Strack. We'll get more into Stego decisions, but I feel pretty good about those two. I have no reason to believe Kentucky cannot compete for championships. I don't believe that for a second. Okay, but the expectations have to match the resources, and the resources have to match the expectations, right? It's like I said earlier. You already poured $82 million into Memorial Coliseum. Kenny Brooks is already one of the highest paid coaches in America, and like I said, I'm pretty sure it's top 10 somewhere in that area, right? Now go give him the resources he needs to compete for championships, right? If I had the ultimate pleasure of sitting down across from Mitch Barnhart or whoever made the NIL decisions, I would say you can do this. Like, you can help make Kentucky a championship program, right? I think Calipari says it. Coaches win games, administrations win championships, right? Give him the resources, okay? You're not going to kill the men's basketball program if you do that. You're not going to kill the football program if you're going to do that, right? Because I'll be honest with you, not every single school in America is investing in women's basketball, so it's a lot easier to kind of capitalize on that opportunity. And again, you have the coach, the brand, the facility, all these things. Again, I would just say, if you're Kentucky, you should look at this Virginia situation. You should look at, if Kenny's already listening to other jobs, if he seriously did consider that Virginia job, and I think even kind of regardless of the NIL aspect, right? Doesn't matter if it was more or less. It was enough to make him consider going. I think if you're Kentucky, you need to invest even more into women's basketball, right? Like, you've got to make this work. You have to, the iron is hot. You got to strike it, right? But I think at the end of the day, regardless of, just whatever happens the rest of the offseason, we already seen Kenny Brooks' body of work, which in that case makes me very glad that he's back. And I'm super, super happy that Kenny Brooks, he's not gone after 2 years. I'm very happy about that. But again, if you want to keep him in the long term, if I'm Kentucky, I'm giving him some more resources if he thinks he needs them, right? I think it was after the Texas game where Kenny said, you don't have to spend the most money in the country to compete. You don't. But at the same time, you can't be a bottom feeder, and you have to be able to, if you're not going to be right up there with South Carolina, Texas, LSU, TCU, all these other schools I'm thinking of, right? USC, UCLA, right? If you're not going to be right up there with them, then you got to be like right here. You got to be like right below, right? You have to be able to be close enough to compete, close enough to where evaluation, player acquisition, all those kinds of things can make the difference for you at the end of the day. Now, quick thank you to today's sponsor, Rollback. Rollback has sponsored all of the episodes this season. They're a great sponsor, always have been, probably always will be. You can change the game with Rollback. That's right, you can. A proud partner of KSR. Get the best fit and the best feel with their incredibly comfortable activewear, from polos and quarter zips to shorts and Delta Performance pants. You will look good and feel good with Rollback. Use promo code KSR for 20% off your first purchase at rollback.com. So, again, I would just say if you're Kentucky, you were able to keep Kenny Brooks around for now. I would hope, and I kind of expect this going into the offseason, just the way Kenny's talked, but I would kind of expect, maybe we do need to give him some more resources, so I really do hope that happens. Got Jared in the chat saying, I don't think money had anything to do with his interest in the Virginia job. I think it did to a degree, but it's like I said, there are certainly a lot of factors outside of money as well. Like, again, he's from Virginia. I think he has family in the area, so I think that matters too. Laura in here saying how, she's glad Coach Brooks is back at Kentucky. Looks like the ladies' team is going to be loaded next year. I think the same thing. We're going to get into these transfer portal targets, and I'm excited about this group because you already know some of the great pieces you have coming back. And I'll get into stay-go decisions right before I get into portal targets. But, I have no reason to think Kentucky will have a good roster. But again, it's like I was talking about. I think, if you want to go in the portal and get a superstar, get someone who can propel you to a national title, might need a little bit more resources. But regardless, I do think next year's team is going to be pretty dang good. So I'm excited, man. And the thing, one more thing about the Kenny Brooks piece, because I do want to talk about targets and whatnot. Austin here saying, I've never been more scared of a coach leaving than I was during the Kenny Brooks news. That's the other thing. Kenny Brooks, when he was hired, in his introductory press conference, talked about how, Kentucky is a sleeping giant. Talked about how the Kentucky brand has gotten, has allowed them to, trying to think of what the phrase is, get into the door, right, of these top recruits. And I would say, I would like to pretend that I've had a massive role in it, but at the end of the day, what Kenny and his staff and his players have been able to do here, you have grown the fan base, right? When I first started covering this team, Kyra Elsie's last year, love her to death, think she's a great person, there's nobody in the stands. And when I say nobody, right? South Carolina came to town. They doubled the Kentucky fans in the stands, right? And I know it kind of looked worse because that year was in Rep Arena because Memorial's being renovated, and it it looked like it was really empty in there. But, I think there might have been 500 to 1,000 fans for the games, if I'm being honest. Kenny Brooks, we're averaging, I think, close to 5,000 fans a game. It's like 4,500 to, I want to say it's between 4,000 and 5,000, but I think it's somewhere in the 4,500 neighborhood, right? Like, you are growing the fan base. When I first started, there was no shot in hell that people would care enough about Kentucky women's basketball to pay a subscription to read news online. And you know what? We got a community of people on KS Board that care about women's basketball, right? Yeah, there's a lot of them that are in it for men's basketball and football too. But there's a lot of them who are like, Phoenix, where's my news? Where's the women's basketball news, right? It's a great place for discussion, all this stuff, and this is not a KS Board ad. I promise it's not. My point is, again, it's like I said, the iron is hot for Kentucky women's basketball. It is. After that Texas game, Kenny Brooks said, we are so close to competing with the Texases of the world. And he's not wrong, right? I do not work for Kenny Brooks PR, okay? This is just me talking. They are close, okay? I think we all saw, you know, in women's basketball, there is a difference in your a difference in your one seeds and say, the rest of, the rest of the country. There is a difference, right? We saw that. But you know what? UCLA beat South Carolina by 20 in the national title game? Right? South Carolina beat UConn. We all know how good UConn is. Right? They beat them by 15 or something like that? So, there is probably a lack of parity from your top 4 or 5 teams to the rest of the country. But the question is, what can we do to put ourselves closer to that 4 or 5? Because I promise you, at the end of the day, this NCAA tournament, I know people are going to look at the games and be like, yeah, we can't get to South Carolina. We can't get to UCLA. That crowd is going to exist. But that's not reality. You think South Carolina was built overnight? You think UCLA was built overnight? Why don't you go look at how long Corey Close has been at UCLA? They just won the national title. That was their first one. You think that happened overnight? So, again, I say, look, why not be all in, right? As we get another comment rolling in. Again, the engagement for this podcast has been the highest it's ever been. Talking about how the fact I kept refreshing to see if he was staying or leaving told me all I needed to know about how I now feel about UK women's basketball. So glad he's still our coach. And I think that is pretty much a unanimous feeling across the fan base. Not just the UK women's basketball fan base. Kentucky, Big Blue Nation, the entire fan base. I think that's pretty unanimous across the whole thing. My tweets being leaked from KS Board. I don't love that. But you know what that says? That says people kind of give a damn now about women's basketball. I think Kentucky is, like Kenny said, so close to competing. And I'll get off my high horse. But they're so close to competing. I'm glad he stuck around. But I just think this was a warning sign to UK to be like, oh, hey, maybe we do need to give him some more resources. Now, let's talk about stay-go decisions. I didn't make a graphic for stay-go decisions, but screw it, right? So, the only stay-go decisions I think are really left on the board are Asia Boone, Kaylin Carroll, and Dominika Perova. And like last week, I think I made this note, said how, I don't think any of those 3 are going to leave. That has not changed, right? I know that is boring news, but I think it is exciting news, right? I still fully expect Asia Boone to be back. I still fully expect Dom to be back. Still fully expect KK to be back. I have no reason to think any of those 3 will be gone. It's interesting because I think Asia Boone probably is your starting 2 guard. And I think with the way the transfer portal is and NIL and everything, I think she'll also kind of serve as the backup point guard again, if I had to guess. There's only so much money to pass around. And I think right now the women's basketball roster is in a space where, a backup point guard would be nice, right? Like a dedicated backup point guard would be a nice luxury to have. But at the end of the day, it is kind of a nice luxury when you think about the depth and all this stuff. Like, I think it's more of a necessity. Go get your starting power forward, for example. So, I think just to kind of save money, to be honest, I think they'll, to save money and to save minutes to spare for the starters and everything in the rotation, I think Kentucky will probably stick with Asia as the backup point guard / starting 2 guard. But I think that's a pretty decent spot to be in. Kaylin Carroll. I think she could compete for a starting bid. I, at this moment, would expect her to start. I actually have her starting at the 3 in my kind of predictive lineup, which is Madden Greenway starting at point guard, Asia Boone starting at the 2, Kaylin Carroll starting at the 3, Claire Strack at the 5, but I think the 4, I don't think they're on the roster yet. I would expect Kentucky to try to go out and get a really solid starting 4. But I think KK, regardless, starting or not, it's going to be a pretty big part moving forward. Dom is interesting because you go look at her and you say, well, you haven't played in 2 years here. But she's been hurt, right? It's not like Kenny, it's not like she's been stuck at the end of the bench, right? At the end of the day, she's torn her ACL twice. So, I think if you're Kentucky, maybe what you get out of her is a bonus, you could say. But at the same time, I do think she can add depth. And again, she was pretty solid her freshman year. And hopefully over the course of these 2 years, I know she's been hurt, but hopefully some training, getting back to perfect health. Hopefully that has helped a little bit. Jared in the chat talking about how it's never boring to keep your own players. Exactly. I think I said it last week with the Clara Strack news. It's addition through retention, right? You have some really good players. There's no reason, like why lose those kids, right? We got Angel, one of my favorites here in the chat, talking about how I've been a big Kentucky fan since 2012. So good to have this live every weekend. The content, excited for next season. Well, thank you. I enjoy having you on all the time. Listen, I think we are now in a space, again, like right now live, there's over 80 people in here. And that, if you go tune into, I don't know, like sources say or something, I'm sure that number's higher, right? Tune into 11 person, I'm sure that number's higher. But there is an audience. There are fans, right? It is growing. Again, I don't like to brag on myself. That's not what I'm doing. But just go look at the engagement on my account. Go look at the engagement on KS Board. Go look at the engagement here. That stuff is growing. And I'd like to think I did some work here, but it's because of Kenny. It's because of the staff and the players and what they've been able to do and what the administration has been able to do so far. But, there's always that, that feeling of, well, we got to keep striving to get better. So, again, very excited about the players coming back. Again, I think Asia Boone, KK, Kaylin Carroll, that is, and Dom Perova are all coming back. I have no reason to believe otherwise. So I do think Lexi Blue and Elsa Vadfors do end up being Kentucky's only two departures. Now, to kind of get into the fact of targets, right? The fun part here. Also, we're nearing 100 people joining them now, so talk about the fan base growing. It's quite literally growing here in the last 30 seconds. I have 4 targets I'm going to go over specifically. Again, I think I may have said this earlier in here. I don't know. I think I said it where, these are not names where someone has said, hey, Phoenix, Kentucky's recruiting this kid. They're on a visit right now. It's nothing like that. But just some digging, just looking at things, kind of reading tea leaves where I can. These are some kids on top of the ones I said last week that I think Kentucky could be looking at. So I want to start with Miami of Ohio's Isle DeVries, right? It's ILSE DeVries. I think that would be Isle, right? From the Netherlands, 6'3" would be a junior next season. I think really fits what this Kentucky women's basketball team needs, and kind of looking at the way Kenny Brooks developed, Amelia Hassett specifically, but even someone like a Tiani Key, but really Amelia Hassett, the way she became this dangerous shooter and great player for Kentucky, I think we can kind of see this kind of thing shape out with Isle DeVries. You can pull her up. I didn't have a graphic made. I'm not quite as good at the whole graphic thing as Steven is, unfortunately. But Isle DeVries, just looking at her, like I said, from the Netherlands, would be a junior, 6'3". Spent her first 2 years at Miami of Ohio. Saw a really big minutes jump this past season. As a freshman, she averaged 19, north of 30. This past season as a sophomore, averaged 12.7 points per game, 4.9 rebounds, 1.9 blocks, shot 71.7% from the free throw line, but I think the big attractive part here for us is that she shot 38.6% from beyond the arc. So those are the kinds of stats. And again, Millie came from JUCO, which is even a step below Miami of Ohio, right? I would feel really, really good about DeVries. I would feel really, really, again, I could see her being the starting 4 or even the starting 3 at Kentucky, with an offseason of Kenny Brooks development, Lindsey Hicks development, all the coaches, right? With an offseason at Kentucky, practicing against Kentucky's players, I think she could be really, really good at Kentucky, and she would be someone you would get to have for the next 2 years, right? Which would really help you there. Nunu Agara, this is a really fun one. So, senior transfer from Stanford, power conference school, historically great school, one of the best all time, obviously, when Tara Vanderveer was the coach. Like I said, 6'2", Stanford transfer, would be a senior. Spent all 3 of her first years there. This past year, I'll start with her freshman year where obviously she was a bit of a role player, playing 14 minutes a game, but these past 2 years has really elevated herself into a really, really solid player. So I want to talk about this past season first, obviously, her junior year, where she averaged 15.3 points per game, 8.7 rebounds per game. And, again, at 6'2", that sounds pretty undersized, obviously. But I do wonder, and we'll figure this out. Tiani Key was 6'5". I don't know if you can keep going that big because there just are not players that big. And even then, when they got Tiani, I want to say she was 6'4". She may have been 6'3", but she was shorter than 6'5" when they originally got her. So, she obviously grew a little bit at Kentucky, or at least, I don't know, maybe wore some high heels on measurement day. Who knows? But, with Agara here, I think it's interesting because I think she obviously, you can, number one, say she has produced at a power conference school. Okay? But I think the other thing you can kind of look at, this season, she shot 18.9% from beyond the arc. That doesn't sound good, right? When you look at that, that's not great. Her first 2 years, however, shot 35.3% and 32.6%. So maybe it was a bad year. I don't know. She got the same amount of playing time last year, so it's not like she got more playing time and just got could show she wasn't as good of a shooter. I don't really know how that dip happens, but has shown she can shoot at north of 30% from 3. So I think that's at least something to look at. And shoots about 80% from the free throw line as well. So I think that would be fun. But those are 2 targets I'm looking at. Tiana Thompson from Ole Miss, obviously conference foe, will be a junior this season from Atlanta, Georgia. Believe has some sort of connection to Tony Morgan. I know she's not on the roster anymore. But actually, you know what? What am I saying? I know exactly what the connection is. They played at Georgia Tech together. I'm sitting here. I do this research beforehand, and I'm like, oh, there's a connection to Tony because they played at Georgia Tech together. And then I get on the podcast, and I'm like, wait, what was that connection again? But I'm looking at it. Played at Georgia Tech together in the 24-25 season. And then as a sophomore this year, she was at Ole Miss, of course. Averaged 6 points per game. Again, like I said, 5'10", will be a junior at the guard spot. But the fun thing about her, shoots 42% from beyond the arc. So that would be extra shooting for Madden Greenway to pass 2, for Claire Strack to pass 2 out of the post. That's the main thing with her. Just hasn't gotten maybe the amount of runs she had hoped for. Averaged 15 minutes per game last year at Ole Miss. Just started twice. I don't know if she'd start at Kentucky either, but I think she could mold herself into a role where, maybe she gets, maybe she gets paid a little more. I don't know. I doubt it coming from Ole Miss, but maybe she get more playing time. And again, that would be a piece where you're saying, 42% from beyond the arc at a power conference school, at an SEC school like Ole Miss. We'll take that. And then the fun one that I consider really fun because I know she'd be good here. Justice Carlton from Texas. This is one that makes me excited. You can probably see I have an extra big smile on my face right now. Because anytime you get a player from a school like Texas, right, just went to the Final Four, been one of the top teams in the country. She was a great contributor for them. Anytime you get a player like Justice Carlton from Texas, that's a grand slam, right? And I don't know, you look at her stats and say, well, Phoenix is a sophomore. She averaged 8.5 points per game. Go look at that roster Texas had. All right? I think she would do very, very good here, especially, again, under the development from Kenny Brooks and this coaching staff. 6'1", will be a junior this year, right? Average 20 minutes per game, started in 28 games. Again, I think she's probably looking for a more defined role, and I think she'd get that at Kentucky. Like I said, this past year averaged 8.5 points per game, 4 rebounds, and shot 47.4% from beyond the arc. I mean, my goodness. Now, I'm not going to pretend that her volume is insane, but that's still a very fun percentage. She would not shoot that here at Kentucky. I think we can just go ahead and say that. But, you know, when Kentucky played Texas, first of all, in the regular season, she scored 17 points, 8 of 12 from the field. She's kind of who killed you in that game, if we're being honest, right? Other than some of the players maybe expect to kill you. Actually, Maddie Booker didn't even have a good game that game. And then in the NCAA tournament, you know, her role towards the end of the season gets squished a little bit, I think a little bit. Just 5 points, 5 rebounds in that game, 2 assists as well. But regardless, Justice Carlton would be somebody you could look at and be like, oh, she would do really good here. So those are the 4 targets I've got for this week. Those are all names that I think would do well at Kentucky, if I'm being honest. DeVries, I think, would be a really fun one. I think she probably would start. You would have her for 2 years. Carlton, you would have for 2 years, assuming she would, you know, assuming these guys don't transfer after 1 year. You know, you'd have her for 2 years as well. And, you know, you go look at Agara and Thompson. You know, I think the staff is cooking, right, so to speak. And maybe cooking in silence a little bit, maybe cooking in like we can't watch, unfortunately. But, you know, most of the 5-star restaurants you go to, I don't think you're back there in the kitchen, right? So it's fun. And again, I think Kentucky is in a really good position to do a lot of good things next year. I think, you know, like I said, they made the Sweet 16 this past year. I don't think there's any reason why they can't go beyond that. And as I said, it feels like 100 times earlier in the episode, I think part of it is, okay, let's see if the admin can step up and give them, you know, more resources, more NIL. So I want to thank you all for tuning in this week. It's been a fun one. Like you all, I am very, very happy that Kenny Brooks is our coach, right? I'm excited because, you know, if Kenny Brooks takes that Virginia job, this program is probably set back for, you know, several years, maybe a half decade's worth of pain and suffering and anguish. But regardless, Kentucky is, you know, should be on an upward trajectory. I don't see why that can't be the case. We'll have to see what Kenny Brooks and the staff do in the transfer portal. But again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Like I said, I'm your host, Phoenix Stevens. Like, comment, subscribe. Do all those wonderful things for us. I would appreciate it. Stephen Peak would really appreciate it. We are so close to 60,000 subscribers. It would mean a lot if we could just get over that hump. If we could just get to 60K. We have made the slow march to 60K for so long. Help us get there. Subscribe. Comment. You know, how happy are you that Kenny Brooks is back as the head coach? Because I'm ecstatic, right? Give me your thoughts on the offseason. Who does Kentucky need to go after? You know, anything you want to pitch in, comment it. We'd really appreciate your feedback. Again, like, comment, subscribe. This has been episode 64 of the Memorial Memo. And until next time, peace out and go Cats.